Welcome to tonight's presentation from the Santa Cruz Museum of Natural History. My name is Marisa Gomez and I'm the Public Programs Manager at the museum. And we are honored to have with us tonight Maddy Kangas from the Xerces Society to share with us ways that we can all support pollinators. But before we dive into the program, I did just want to get through a few housekeeping measures. First, let me share that tonight's program is in support of the museum's latest special exhibit, Pollinators Keeping Company with Flowers, which is on view through this Sunday, March 6th. So if you have yet to visit, you should do so soon. It's really illuminating and gorgeous and features the many bees, beetles, butterflies, birds, and even bats that aid in the ever important process of pollination. So I hope you have the opportunity to swing by the museum to check it out. If you already have, let us know in the chat. What'd you think? I also want to acknowledge that the museum resides on the traditional and unceded territory of the Yupi tribe of the Awaswas Nation. Today, these lands are stewarded by the Amamutsin tribal band whose ancestors were taken to Mission Santa Cruz and Mission San Batista during Spanish colonization of the Central Coast. The Amamutsin are working hard to fulfill their obligation to Creator, to care for and steward Mother Earth and all living things through relearning efforts and the Amamutsin Land Trust. And also just please note that we'll be communicating with you tonight via the chat, and we'd love it if you could send your messages to everyone. So I think it defaults to host and panelists. So before you send a message, if you want to toggle it down to everyone, that would be great. And let us know where you're streaming in from. What's your favorite pollinator, whether it's a plant, a critter, a plant and critter that go together. Let us know, say hello in the chat. And now let me introduce tonight's speaker, Maddy Kangas. So Maddy serves as a Monarch Butterfly Conservation Planner and NRCS partner biologist for the Central Coast of California as part of the Xerces Society, which is an international organization that has been working to protect invertebrates since 1971 and is just really the gold standard resource for learning about insect conservation. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and ta-da, here's Maddy. Thanks for joining us today, Maddy. Good to have you here.
Thank you.
So do you have an answer to our question of what's your favorite pollinator?
Oh yeah. Well, I feel like I'm obligated to say the monarch, but it's not in the monarch. I actually really like squash bees.
Oh yeah.
They'll take their naps inside a squash flower. So those are definitely a favorite.
Good choice. I wonder what's coming in through the chat. We've got monarch and swamp milkweed. We got people tuning in from Palo Alto, SoCal, Santa Cruz, Lynchburg, Virginia. What? Thousand Oaks. We love bumblebees. We love, oh gosh, Pycnanthemum muticum. Love scientific names. We love meadow blazing star and enjoy watching bumblebees. Cool. So keep them coming. If you have a favorite pollinator, we love to hear it. All right. And we're going to have time for questions at the end. But if you have something that comes up while Maddy's presenting, you can feel free to drop it in the chat or in the Q&A, and we'll get to it at some point. All right, you can feel free to take it away, Maddy.
Perfect. Thank you. And thank you, Marisa, for coordinating this webinar. I'm so excited to be here with you all to talk about pollinator conservation and the different ways that you can get involved. I'm Maddy. I am a Monarch Conservation Planner and NRCS partner biologist with Xerces. My primary responsibility is to provide technical and planning assistance to NRCS field personnel on pollinator and beneficial insect conservation. Xerces has partner biologists working all across the country, and 2 of them in California. Just a little bit about the Xerces Society. We are a science-based nonprofit organization founded by Dr. Robert Michael Pyle in 1971 as an organization of butterfly scientists. We focus on the conservation of invertebrates and their habitat, And the conservation of these animals is often overlooked because of their size, but so many of our ecological and agricultural systems depend on them. They really are the little things that run the world. And this motto, protecting the life that sustains us, is our way of saying we need pollinators and other invertebrates as much as they need us. Our namesake is the Xerces blue butterfly. It was the first butterfly known to go extinct in North America due to human activities. It lived in the coastal sand dunes around San Francisco, so not too far from us now. And we work with the goal to prevent the extinction of other butterfly and invertebrate species. Just a brief reminder of what an invertebrate is. That's any animal lacking a backbone. It includes multiple classes of animals, from insects to crustaceans and mussels. And these invertebrates play crucial roles in our survival, including helping to break down organic matter, keeping pest populations in check, serving as food on the base of the food chain, pollinating crops and wildflowers. Invertebrates account for over 95% of animal diversity on the planet. Today, we're going to just focus on pollinators. So another reminder of what pollination is, that's the transfer of male gametes or pollen to female reproductive structures or stigma. Because plants can't move, they rely on animals or wind to transfer their gametes between flowers. And a plant that has been fertilized results in seed and fruit formation. There are thousands of species of pollinators in North America. Over 800 butterfly species occur here. But one of the most important pollinators are bees. So just take a few moments to carefully look at this picture and decide how many species of bees you think there are here. And I'm betting that for many of us, the first bee that comes to mind is either a honeybee or a bumblebee, the fuzzy yellow and black striped insects. These are certainly the most widely known types of bees, but we actually have a tremendous diversity of native bees in the United States, and pictured here are 6 of them. They come in a huge range of colors and shapes and sizes, and there are 3,600 species in the US. Most of our native bees are solitary and generally live for about a year. This is an example of what a typical solitary bee's life cycle looks like. The adult stage will last from 3 to 4 weeks. And the female will mate once and then spend the rest of her life creating and provisioning a nest to lay her eggs. Before she closes each little cell, she will provision it with food for her offspring, which is a mix of nectar and pollen to form a little loaf called bee bread inside the brood cell. And she'll lay an egg in the cell, usually on top of the loaf, and seal it up. And when she's completed and sealed all of the cells in her nest, she'll cap off the entrance and leave. 1 to 3 weeks later, an egg will hatch and a little soft-bodied grub-like larva emerges. And feeding on the bee bread, the larva grows for the next 6 to 8 weeks before turning into a pupa. During this pupal stage, which is 8 to 9 months, the bee transforms inside of a cocoon, and that's where the adult forms. When it emerges, the adult bee is fully grown and it's ready to mate and continue the cycle. While bee eggs are laid in little nests, butterflies are a bit different. They begin their life as eggs laid on or near a species' particular host plant. And the eggs will hatch into tiny soft-bodied caterpillars. They'll go through a few caterpillar instars before turning into a chrysalis, which is a mummy-like stage in between larva and adult. During this stage, the entire structure of the caterpillar is reorganized as it completes the metamorphosis into a winged adult. And butterflies are quite particular about which plants they lay their eggs on. For example, the monarch butterfly we know and love will only lay its eggs on milkweed. But pollinators are extremely valuable for wildlife. When they're moving around that pollen, they trigger the development of fruits and seeds, which are a major part of the diet of many birds and other mammals. The pollinators themselves can also be food for wildlife. It takes between 6,000 and 9,000 caterpillars to raise a clutch of chickadees. Grizzly bears will eat various fruits in the summer that were pollinated by pollinators, as well as cutworm moths that can serve as a source of fat, sometimes as many as 40,000 a day, which is quite impressive. And more than 85% of our flowering plants require some sort of pollinator to move their pollen around. So they're very important to the process of pollination. And they're particularly important to us. Worldwide, the estimated 20,000 or so species of bees contribute between 5 and 8% of global crop production. And that's an annual market value upwards of $235 billion in 2016 money. Here we see a picture of a produce section at a Whole Foods. All of the fruits and vegetables we know and love are here. And here is what that produce section would look like in a world without pollinators. The Whole Foods market staff took out 237 of the 453 products, which was about 52% of the produce items that are normally sold at the store. Removed items included apples and avocados and eggplants and squash. If we didn't have pollinators, our next option would be hand pollination of crops, which as a small gardener is not something that I want to add to my to-do list. I can't imagine trying to do it on a production scale. And perhaps you have seen this headline that has showed up in the New York Times. It's true that we are seeing insect declines all over the world. More than 40% of invertebrate pollinator species globally are facing extinction, particularly bees and butterflies. Here's a few more details on that. 28% of bumblebees are threatened and over 17% of North American butterflies are at risk. And this includes both generalists, species that can visit a variety of plants, and specialists, which are really limited in their diets. But it's not just pollinators. An increasing number of studies are showing declines in insects around the world. We do still need greater investment in basic science and further analyses of existing data, but we know enough to take action. Between 1986 and 2016, insect biomass declined by 76% in German nature reserves. And a worldwide compilation of long-term insect abundance studies shows that the number of land-dwelling insects is in decline. And on average, there's been a decrease of 0.9% per year, which is about 24% over 30 years. And this decline is quite visible in the Western monarch population. Just to clarify what a Western monarch is, these are monarchs that migrate to coastal California and Mexico. These monarchs breed in California and the Southwest from spring to fall, and go into more interior parts of the West to finish their breeding season in early summer. There are milkweed and monarch breeding. There is milkweed and monarch breeding happening in nearly all parts of the West from June to August. One exception is coastal areas of the Pacific Northwest, which are shown on this map in blue, where milkweed was not historically found and monarch breeding is relatively limited there. In the fall, migration is then triggered by day length and temperature, and they will make their way back to the California coast. So here is a map of overwintering sites across the coast of California. Monarchs will overwinter in clusters in microhabitats from October to March, although we're finding that monarchs seem to be leaving earlier and earlier from their overwintering sites. But generally, they will stop laying eggs during the winter, with a few exceptions at the over 400 overwintering sites across the coast. The monarch population is tracked. The biggest way this is done is through the Western Monarch Thanksgiving Count. This is a community science effort that is spearheaded by Xerces with volunteers up and down the coast. And counts occur in California to Baja, and a few inland sites in California and some small sites in Arizona. And this count is the primary way that we gauge the size of the Western monarch population. Data from these counts have been used in several research papers that have reported significant declines in the Western monarch population. Here is a graph of that population change over time. The green bars represent monarch abundance, and the blue line represents the number of sites monitored. It is important to note that, like many insect species, monarch populations naturally fluctuate from year to year, partially due to differences in the weather or other environmental factors. So it's important to look at long-term trends rather than year-to-year changes to see how the population is doing. But you can see here that despite increased survey effort, monarchs have declined by 95% of their historic population in the millions. And this is happening for a number of different reasons. Both monarchs and pollinators are threatened by a similar suite of issues. This includes habitat loss, so that could be agricultural intensification, or policies that encourage fence row to fence row farming. It could be development in urban areas, other land management like mowing roadsides. In the West, some of these important areas for monarch breeding happen to be in productive agricultural regions, though. So habitat loss, habitat degradation, widespread use of insecticides, climate change, parasites, and diseases have all been implicated in the monarch decline. And with these significant declines, Xerces has been working collaboratively to define priority action zones for monarch recovery. And here in Santa Cruz, we fit nicely into priority area number 1, which is overwintering habitat and early breeding zones for monarchs as they're leaving their overwintering sites. And also in response to these declines, Xerces has put out a call to action. And there are 5 components in this. It's protecting overwintering sites and breeding habitat, protecting monarchs from pesticides, restoring breeding habitat across their migration route, and answering key research questions about how to best aid in monarch recovery. So at this point, we'll transition into how you can contribute to monarch and pollinator conservation. It may seem that the issues facing the insects we care about are so big, they can only be addressed through top-down policy by politicians and conservation groups and scientists. But in reality, change often happens from the ground up as new practices that are introduced locally become nationwide trends. And creating habitat for pollinators is one of the most important actions that individuals can take in pollinator conservation, and it can happen in any sized space. When designing habitat for pollinators, a good first step is to look at what pollinators need. Pollinators need food, so this includes nectar and pollen, and in the case of butterflies, host plants to lay their eggs on. It includes shelter, so nest sites, overwintering sites, and refuge, and protection from pesticides and various habitat disturbances. First, we'll take a look at food as a habitat requirement, and these are a few things to consider when you're choosing plants for your habitat. Do the plants included meet a species' needs throughout their life cycle? Have you included butterfly host plants? Will you have flowers blooming across the growing season? How easy is it to establish the plants that you've chosen? And how much will all of this cost? Diversity is one piece of this puzzle, and I would argue it's one of the most important pieces. What we put into our plantings is one of the few things we have control over. And diversity, meaning a variety of plant species in one place, is key to a planting's success. The more diverse your planting is, the better chance it has of long-term health and self-sustainability, which can translate to lower management costs. Over the years, there will be variations in invasive species pressure and soil conditions and climate, such as extreme drought or extreme moisture. And having a diversity of plants can ensure that more species are able to adapt to these extremes and therefore respond to changing environmental conditions. Diversity will also help attract a wider diversity and abundance of pollinators. It supports soil health and soil life, and of course, make your planting more resistant to climate change and more resistant to weeds, and can be more cost effective in the long term. When thinking about diversity, look for different characteristics or traits across the community that lend themselves to the whole. For example, different families or guilds of plants like cool season grasses and warm season grasses, sedges, rushes, legumes, non-legume forbs. And this functional diversity can reduce invasion by similar species. It can be easier to establish, and it promotes a stand in the long term. You'll also want to consider designing your pollinator planting so that things are blooming in every period of the growing season, because pollinators are active that entire time and need food that entire time. Choosing a diversity of plants with different bloom periods provides food for pollinators throughout the seasons, and flowers in the spring and fall are especially important for bumblebees and other native bees. A number of bee species are active only in the spring or only in the fall, and they need something blooming early or late in the season. Spring is also when bumblebee queens are emerging and establishing their colonies. And this can be one of their most sensitive times in colony development because the queen has to establish and provision a nest without the assistance of any workers that come along later in the year after she's done that. Including species from a range of appropriate plant families can benefit a wider variety of wildlife. And can also help prevent erosion and build soil health. Different plant families have particular flower shapes and colors and bloom times and nutritional value for specialized pollinators. What are specialized pollinators? Generally, this refers to bees, and these are bees that forage from only one family or a few related genera of plants. Some will only collect pollen from a single species of plant. Flowers in the aster family and the legume family tend to be important for a high percentage of specialists. Willows are also a favorite of the specialists. On the end, there is a specialist bee in California that only visits buckwheat. What percentage of bees that are specialists within a region varies, but often up to 40 or 50% of bees in a given location are specialists. You can check out the link at the bottom to learn more about specialist bees in California, of which there are over 600. And this website has information about each species, including which plants they specialize on. For the monarch butterfly in particular, it's important to plant milkweed where it's regionally appropriate, generally more than 5 miles away from the coastline. And it's especially important to plant species that emerge early in the season. Early emerging species native to California include Asclepias areocarpa, Californica, and cordifolia. Some later emerging species include fascicularis, which is the narrow leaf, and I think the most common in the state, and speciosa. It's also important to plant native milkweed. Non-native milkweed, namely tropical milkweed, is associated with higher rates of the parasite OE, which causes wing deformation in adult monarchs. If you already have tropical milkweed in your garden, it's very important to cut it back to the ground in the fall, like October or November, and repeatedly throughout the winter to mimic native milkweed phenology and break the disease cycle. Ideally, tropical milkweed would be removed entirely and replaced with native milkweed or nectar species. But we understand that at this point it's very widespread. But milkweed alone is not enough. It's very important for people to plant nectar species, especially flowers that bloom in the early spring, February to April, to provide critical nectaring habitat for monarchs as they are leaving their overwintering grounds. If you are near an overwintering ground, it is also important to plant nectaring plants that flower later in the season when they're coming back to these sites, so September through October or November through January. The question, of course, comes up whether pollinators can use ornamentals. While they can use some of them, many ornamentals don't have much value for pollinators. It's best to avoid double-flowered hybrids and other ornate modern varieties or cultivars, which often produce little or no pollen and nectar. Garden varieties are often bred for characteristics that are desirable to humans and not necessarily to bees or other pollinators. all plants are not equal. Just because it blooms doesn't mean it gives pollen or nectar. And just because it gives pollen and nectar doesn't mean that bees like it. So that's something to keep in mind as you're choosing plants in a pollinator habitat. The next thing we'll look at is nesting habitat for bees. About 70% of our native bees nest underground. You may have seen this before. It looks kind of like an ant's nest from above. So they like open, bare patches of soil. They can be found in turf. So in managing your site for ground nesting bees, it's best generally to avoid tillage or other practices that disturb the ground. They don't like heavy mulching or landscape fabric. Although some species do like a light rock mulch and pebbles. And these bees are not aggressive, unlike some wasps that you can find nesting in your yard. These will not come after you. So 70% are ground nesting, and about 30%, the other 30%, nest as solitary individuals in wood tunnels, usually hollow stems or other abandoned beetle borer holes found in dead trees or stumps. These tunnel nesting bees will utilize these tunnels or snags and soft-centered twigs like elderberry and sumac and blackberry or other shrubs. Brush piles can harbor wood and tunnel nesting bees, and some of these bees have even been known to take advantage of gaps between shingles or other small crevices on buildings, and even snail shells. The tunnel nesting bees will pack their cells in with pieces of leaves, mud, sawdust, or other resins and plant fibers in the landscape. So to manage for stem nesting bees, it's best to leave plant species with hollow and soft pithy stems through the winter. You can cut them back to heights between 8 and 24 inches. And then the bees will emerge in the spring. So if you feel you must prune, it's best to do it after that time. If you're interested in resources for choosing plants in your landscape, some of these are very helpful. Xerces has detailed plant lists, and I find that's a good place to get started. But California has some really good regionally specific tools that can be helpful as you plan a habitat. Besides plants, we also want to think about some other sheltering characteristics of the site. While monarch migration is well known, it's not the norm when it comes to butterflies. In fact, the vast majority of butterflies and moths overwinter in landscape as an egg, caterpillar, chrysalis, or even adult. And in all but the warmest climates, these butterflies use leaf litter for winter cover. Beyond butterflies, bumblebees also rely on leaf litter for protection. At the end of the summer, a mated queen bumblebee will burrow an inch or two into the soil and hibernate for the winter. And an extra thick layer of leaves is welcome protection from the elements. Besides this, there are many other animals that live in the leaves, including spiders and snails and worms and beetles. And these support the chipmunks and the turtles and the birds and the amphibians that rely on insects for food. So it's easy to see how important leaves can be for sustaining these natural food webs. While a couple inches or more of leaves could smother turf, research has shown that a thin layer of leaves can actually benefit lawns, since decomposing leaves provide organic matter and nutrients to help lawns grow. If you do remove leaves, it's best to do it in the spring, waiting until late in the season to increase chances of successful emergence by butterflies, queen bumblebees, and other overwintering animals. And another element to shelter is thinking about pesticides. We often think about these in agricultural areas, but they're commonly used in urban areas as well. In fact, more pesticides are used per acre in urban areas than in many agricultural areas. In our communities, they're used for cosmetic reasons and to maintain manicured landscapes. But they can wash off from the grass and patios and impervious surfaces and end up in our waterways. In fact, 61% of rivers in agricultural areas and 90% of rivers in urban areas contain pesticides at levels that are risky to aquatic life. In order to protect pollinators from pesticides, it's important to think about how they are exposed. Various exposure pathways depend on the pesticide and how it was applied, but these include direct and indirect contact, contaminated nest sites or materials, and systemic contact. If pesticides move through plants they are applied to. There we go. So best practice is to avoid using pesticides, but if you must use them, minimize that use and read the guidance carefully. But even when label instructions are followed, there's still limited protection for many of the insect species we are trying to protect. This all comes back to lawns. Over 40 million acres of lawn is in the US and could be considered the largest irrigated crop in the country. And lawns have very simplified food networks. You can see just one chain is emerging out of this lawn habitat. But by incorporating food and nesting resources and creating safe spaces to shelter, we can attract a great diversity of life to our homes. And the great news is that insects are able to exploit small patches and partial habitat that are suitable for nesting or foraging. And small improvements to habitats can have dramatic results, especially for generalist species. In an effort to help people who are interested in planting habitat for pollinators, Xerces has a habitat kit program in California. And this is a program that gives out free plant materials to partners in the community who are working on pollinator conservation, a lot of working lands projects in agricultural areas and urban community gardens, basically anything besides a home garden. Xerces is giving out free plant materials. This has contributed to more than 400 projects throughout the state, and over 150,000 plants have been distributed in breeding zones of California. Last year, we had 42 different agricultural projects, 24 in natural areas, and 23 in urban areas. Our 2022 kit season launched on March 1st. And the interest form can be found online if you happen to be working with an organization who could use a boost in their pollinator habitat project. And here's just a few photos of people who picked up their plant materials last year. Of course, it's important to share what you are doing with others. Whether verbally or by using signs to showcase a habitat, your habitat, because it can inspire others to take part in these actions as well. But if you don't have space to put in a pollinator garden, there's still a lot you can do for pollinator conservation. Besides planting habitat, Xerces hosts a lot of opportunities for people to get directly involved in gathering data on invertebrates. Community science is the practice of public participation and collaboration in scientific research, and it increases scientific knowledge in the community. You may have heard this referred to as citizen science. But through community science, people share and contribute to data monitoring and collection programs. The information gathered by community science projects can be extremely useful. Through our Bumblebee Watch program, rare species have been found in unexpected places and non-native species expansion has been tracked. The decline of the monarch has largely been documented by community science efforts too. So I'll just go into a few of our programs. One example of a successful community science effort is Bumblebee Watch. This is a collaboration between Xerces and other partner organizations that provides a hub for gathering and identifying photos of bumblebees submitted by volunteers. So equipped with cameras or smartphones, people will check gardens and parks and farms and natural areas for bumblebees. They'll snap a photo and upload it to the website. And like I said, this has led to rare species discoveries and species needing protection and documenting other species hundreds of miles outside of their previously known ranges. Another cool effort, well, first, I guess, this is a map of data from Bumblebee Watch, and this is verified records. And you can see that despite a rich history of observation and some more recent data, we need to do a better job getting outside of urban areas and to more remote areas of the state, including the Central Valley. So the California Bumblebee Atlas is our new community science effort to do that. We randomly assigned grid cells across the entire state, excluding areas owned by the Department of Defense. And the goal is to recruit community scientists to adopt grid cells and conduct surveys within those cells. So people will spread out across the state and survey for bumblebees and are asked to report back whatever they find. There are workshops offered online that will provide participants with all of the necessary skills and knowledge and confidence to run these surveys independently. And they can be done individually or with a small group of people. The survey methods are catch and release, so no bees are harmed. And the data collection can be done using your phone. But our team of researchers will be able to use this information to assess species distribution, population shifts, habitat associations, and more. We'll be able to use the data to identify regions within the state that are supporting healthy populations, and those that are in need of restoration or management, and highlight landscape features that are associated with bumblebee habitat in the state. We have community science efforts focused on monarchs. This is the Western monarch milkweed mapper. And although there is a lot we do know about monarchs, there's still a lot that we don't. So this community science effort will help answer questions like, where and when do monarchs cross through the Central Valley? Where and when are they stopping to lay eggs? Do they have preferences for one type of milkweed over another? Do they prefer large or small patches of milkweed? So people who participate in this will view, add, and share observations of both milkweed and monarchs in all life stages. There are over 46,000 records so far, but still a lot more needed to better understand where monarchs are and milkweed is growing. Kind of similar to the bumblebee issues, there are particular gaps in our non-urban areas and interior parts of the states. The data collected will help to build habitat suitability models that are used in monarch conservation. If you're not familiar with these, it's a better way to visualize the quality of different areas for a species. So that's how that data is being used. Another option is to get involved in the community. So Xerces has the Bee City and Bee Campus USA initiatives. These programs work to motivate communities to sustain pollinators by increasing the abundance of native plants, providing nest sites, and reducing the use of pesticides locally. So Bee City USA affiliates make commitments to conserve native pollinators, which are laid out in a resolution adopted by the local city council. So city staff and community members work together to carry out these commitments and make their city a better place for pollinators. Incorporated cities, towns, counties, and communities across the US have been invited to make these commitments and become Bee City USA affiliates. So that's another way to be involved in pollinator conservation, is to organize locally. Now I know this is a lot, but Xerces has a ton of resources to help you on your pollinator conservation journey. These include plant lists and guides to habitat creation, tips on managing pollinators and pesticide guidelines, and assessment guides for pollinator and beneficial insects. Many of these are available on our website as PDFs, and we also have books available for purchase. These are just a few of our resources for planting guides and plant lists and more. For example, let's say you want to put in pollinator habitat, but you want to know what sort of habitat you already have available. This is a guide that can help you determine what percentage of your site is already vegetated, how much of it is native, do you have season-long bloom presence, and what are your pesticide practices, and what community actions are being taken already. We have the regional plant lists. Here's just a look at the first page of a Central Coast plant list. So very site specific that you can pull from. And again, this is a really great starting place if you're starting to take on habitat. We also have guidance on buying bee-safe plants. Pollinator gardening has skyrocketed in popularity, and increasingly garden centers and nurseries are labeling plants as pollinator friendly, or adding bee or butterfly images to plant tags to denote their ability to attract these insects. And consumers could make the assumption that these images or phrases mean that the plants are safe for bees, and that pesticides harmful to insects weren't applied during production. And while this may be the case for some growers, it is not always. There's no legal or nursery industry standard definition or set of practices mandated for the use of terms like pollinator friendly or bee friendly. So our guides for buying bee-safe plants will take you through some important questions, like looking at which suppliers take steps to limit pesticides, what practices, what non-chemical practices they're using for prevention, and things like that. And if you plant habitat and want to know if your habitat is working, we have all sorts of bee and butterfly monitoring protocol. and a few of our books to display as well. If you're interested in learning more, we have webinars all the time. Here's just a couple coming up. But I will end by saying that donors make all of the work that Xerces does possible. If you're not already, we encourage you to become a member. And with that, I thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Maddie. Wow, so many resources. It's overwhelming and amazing.
It is.
and we do have a number of questions that have come in. I just also wanted to share that we have printed out a number of the resources that you mentioned today already and have them available for view in our exhibit for people to like further explore these concepts. And we'll definitely be sharing a long list of resources in a follow-up email probably tomorrow, which will include a recording for tonight's talk too. So if you weren't like jotting down like mad, all of those links, don't worry, they'll come your way. And let's get to some of the questions. I also wanted to note that, so we had like a raised hand if you, and then it went away, but if one way that we can do the raised hand is if you'd like to ask a question verbally instead of using the chat, you can raise your hand and then I'll give you the permission allowed to talk. So a couple of different things that came through. Let's start at the bottom of this list here. From Sylvia, does Xerces share data with other citizen science projects throughout the US, such as the Monarch Larva Monitoring Project?
Yeah, that's very closely tied to the Western Monarch Milkweed Mapper. We partner very closely with Monarch Joint Venture, which runs that program. So we are all collaborating.
Cool. Yeah, and thanks for sharing where the community science data is going to go too. That's always good to know. And the Bee Atlas, is that, it said spring 2020, did that launch already? Or
yes,
is it has.
It has or is about to. It's happening now. So people can go to the California Bumblebee Atlas website, and there should be a link on there to sign up, and they'll contact you with information if you're interested in adopting a grid cell.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that one sounds like a really interesting project. You mentioned some gaps in Bumblebee data. You showed that image of like all the orange dots and then like gray areas, and noted that we need like more data from the Central Valley, places like that. Kari is curious if that's because they aren't, like, maybe bumblebees just aren't prevalent in some of those areas, like for instance the Mojave Desert, where she noticed a big gap. Is that potentially part of it?
Surprisingly, there are actually a lot of bumblebee species in the desert regions. Desert regions can host some of the most bee species in the world. So I think a lot of it is more to do with lack of manpower than lack of bee species. And our community scientists are coming from these populated areas, and that's where we have the data points. So at least for now, we think it's lack of manpower.
Yeah, so next time you go visit Joshua Tree or something,
check it out.
Be prepared to take pictures of bumblebees. Jan's curious about the, I think it was the habitat kits. You mentioned that they're now available for people in California to request. Is that a service that's available in other states too?
It's not widely available. There's one in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and a program out east. Hopefully it will expand further as it grows, but California is the big one right now.
Okay. And then again from Kari. Okay, so you had a couple of great slides mid-presentation listing things to think about regarding plant selection and some of the functions plants provide pollinators. Does Xerces have something equivalent which could be used as a fact sheet? She's planning for a plant sale for the California Plant Society and wants something to be able to hand out. Would that be something you could include in follow-up links?
Yes, can do.
Okay, yeah, and I loved what you said about oh, this was so interesting, bringing up the ornamental plants, because I've started to think myself personally about like, okay, climate's changing. That means that, just, the way things were 30 years ago doesn't necessarily mean that it's what's best for pollinators now. Maybe we need to help them out with like some extra plants. But what you shared about the way that like genetic engineering has worked with certain ornamentals, and then just like the two petal thing, that was wild. I never would have thought about that.
And it's hard because there's not enough research to have a broad picture of whether ornamentals are good or bad, but there are a few things we know, and the double petaled is not a great one.
Okay, so at the very least, avoid that. Yeah, I'm thinking like rosemary, like that. I think of bees on rosemary, for instance. But and also just thinking about like the need to provide food year round, and maybe that's going to become harder and harder with our changing climate and using native plants. But I guess like maybe closer to native as opposed to other side of the globe might be a good place to start.
Yeah, it's a tricky time to be doing conservation, that's for sure.
Seriously. And also Kari just wanted to note that she uses a lot of your guides, and they're great. And she wants a brochure on all plants are not created equal, which I think is what we were just talking about. So any resources about that? And then let's see. There's a couple more that came in. Do you know if there's a Xerces NRCS liaison in Montana?
No, there's not.
There's not. Okay. So Hannah's wondering, I read about flax being an issue for pollinators. Is that true, and why or why not?
If it is, I'm not sure. I haven't heard that before.
Okay, something for us to look into. Hannah's also curious, is there a pollinator plant replacement for thistle? I live in a state where thistle is heavily frowned upon.
Yeah, thistles are in the aster family. So if you can incorporate, which is the sunflower family, sorry. So if you can incorporate various sunflowers, that could be good. There are also some native species of thistle. I'm not sure if there are where you are, but that could be something to look into as well, especially if there are some specialist bees in your area that are using thistle.
Okay, cool. And then we also have a question about bug hotels. Are they helpful, or is it best to focus on plants to provide habitat?
It's better to focus on plants that provide habitat. One problem you can get with those artificial habitats is a tendency towards disease when you're packing in a bunch of animals into the same location. But moderation is okay. Smaller hotels are okay. It's not going to hurt anything. So whatever your space allows for.
Okay. Yeah, I had not thought about when you mentioned about pruning plants back, but leaving enough of the stem if it's a hollow stem over winter. I'd never thought about that before, but that's a really great tip for substitute, instead of your hotel, doing something like that.
Yeah.
And then also I'm curious about honeybees and how we associate European non-native honeybees so much with agriculture, which you started the talk off with talking about the need for pollinators because it gives us food, and we need the food, and we think of European honeybees so much with that. Do honeybees cause any issues for native pollinators that you know about, like in terms of competition for food? Should we be concerned about keeping honeybees in our gardens, or should we be trying to support honeybees? What do you think about that?
Honeybees can compete with natives for food. So it's best if you are keeping honeybees to make sure there's a lot of food available in your landscape so you can support both of them. So that can be a problem. But if you're strategic about it and know the limits of your landscape, keeping honeybees is a wonderful hobby.
Yeah, it's true. And then also, yeah, just another thing that I really loved was the leave the leaves and the note about, I think like I knew that leaves can be good habitat, but then just like the idea of if you're raking leaves and it's the middle of winter, they're probably things living in there. But if you rake them at another time of year when they're out and about, so I really liked the way that was framed.
Yeah.
So thanks for that.
Mhm.
And let's see, are there any other questions? We just got a great talk. We've got a couple of great talks coming in the chat. People appreciating you, Maddy. And yeah, I think we've maybe, if you have any last minute questions that you want to ask of Maddy, get them in the chat now. And I'll just reiterate that we're going to be sending out a follow-up email with lots of resources. And also make sure that you come visit the museum this weekend if you can, if you're not in Montana or Virginia, to visit the Pollinators exhibit before it closes. And while you're at the museum, you can check out our pretty great pollinator garden that we have outside. I'm really interested in using the checklist that you shared on our garden at the museum and see how we fare. But there's a lot of really great stuff in bloom, and I was pleased to realize that I think we're doing a lot of things right out at the Garden Learning Center at the museum. So it's a good time to come check it out. Jan, so we did have another question just come in. Jan is wondering, are there similar community science programs in the Midwest, or are a lot of those community science programs like more national, or?
Some of them are. I can't give you any names off the top of my head, but I know there are a lot of community science efforts in the Midwest. And if you wanted to shoot me an email, I'd be happy to connect you with those resources.
Yeah, and again, we'll send some links, including linking to the general website, and you can do a lot of digging in there. I'm sure a lot of us are going to spend a lot of time digging through the website. There's so much, and I love how it's organized by, you can very easily say like, I live here, and then you can look at all of the resources that are specifically for your state or for your region. And Sylvia is also saying that you can just Google citizen science or community science in your state, and some things will pop up. Also note that the museum is hosting for those of you who live closer to the Santa Cruz area, we are hosting a walk in the CZU Lightning Complex burn zone on March 20th. It's actually part of a series of walks that we'll do every month, March, April, May, in partnership with state parks. And it's a newly reopened area of Henry Cowell State Park that was burned in August 2020. And one of the things that we're going to be doing during those walks is helping to train people up on how to use iNaturalist, which is a community science platform. So if you're really interested in the community science angle, that might be, and you're like not so familiar with it, that might be a good program to come to wet your whistle. It's free, and registration is now open. So you can check out our website to sign up for that. And Kari's also recommending People and Pollinator Network as something to look into. And Maddy, do you have any last notes to leave us with?
Just thank you all for what you're doing in your communities, because every little bit makes a difference. So
so true. This is really important work, and you gave us lots of tools to do our part. So thank you so much, and thanks to everyone for joining us tonight. You can expect an email from me hopefully tomorrow. And in the meantime, you can reach out. So Maddy's got her email there. And then you can also, if you want to direct questions to me to share with Maddy, I can do that too. And I wish you all a lovely evening, and hopefully it maybe has a little bit of rain, which I've been experiencing here today. All right. Have a good night.